There is something almost sacred about having one place in the world that belongs completely to you. Not because it's expensive or impressive, but because nobody else gets to decide what happens inside it. For me, that place was my garage. My name is Ethan Mercer. I live just outside Cedar Ridge, Colorado, and after 22 years as a heavy equipment mechanic, I had learned that fixing machines was a whole lot easier than fixing people. Every evening I'd pull into my driveway, hit the garage remote, and disappear into my own little world where unfinished woodworking projects sat beside old motorcycle parts. Country music played softly from an ancient radio, and nobody could tell me what color my mailbox should be or how high my grass was allowed to grow. At least that's how things used to be before the Homeowners Association elected its newest president, Denise Holloway. Denise wasn't the loudest person in the neighborhood. That would have been easier to deal with. She was calm, polished, always smiling just enough to make you wonder whether she was being friendly or collecting evidence against you. She carried a leather folder everywhere, knew every section of the HOA handbook by memory, and somehow managed to make every conversation sound like a courtroom cross-examination. The first letter arrived because my trash can stayed at the curb until 7 in the evening after I worked a double shift. The second came because my porch light was apparently the wrong shade of warm white. Then came complaints about the bird feeder, the extension cord I used while sanding furniture, and eventually even the smell of fresh stain drifting out of my open garage. Every notice ended the same way, citing community standards and reminding me that repeated violations could result in escalating fines. At first, I laughed about it with my neighbor Carl, a retired firefighter who had lived across the street for almost 15 years. He'd shake his head, sip coffee from a dented travel mug, and tell me, "Buddy, some people retire from working and immediately find a full-time job minding everybody else's business." We joked because it seemed harmless back then. It wasn't. Denise wasn't interested in rules. She was interested in control, and I slowly became her favorite target. Every Saturday morning, I'd catch her walking slower whenever she passed my driveway, pretending to check landscaping while glancing into my garage. Once she actually stepped halfway inside and pointed at my tool cabinet. "Visible clutter affects neighborhood appeal," she said with that practiced smile. I looked at her for a second before answering. "You're standing inside my garage." She didn't even flinch. "The door is open. Anything visible from the street reflects on the community." I remember standing there with a wrench in my hand, wondering if I had somehow wandered into a reality show without realizing it. I closed the garage door right in front of her. She filed another complaint the next morning. Weeks turned into months, and every little interaction chipped away at my patience. Friends started asking why I looked exhausted even on weekends. It wasn't work. It was knowing that someone was constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for me to make the smallest mistake. Then came the night that changed everything. I'd been repairing a bulldozer engine nearly 60 miles away, got home close to 9, and all I wanted was a cold drink and an hour alone in the garage before bed. I pressed the remote as I turned into the driveway, expecting the familiar sight of my workbench. Instead, the garage door rolled upward to reveal a silver luxury SUV parked perfectly in the center of my garage. For a split second, I honestly thought I'd gone to the wrong house. Then I recognized the vanity plate. Denise 1. My stomach tightened. The engine was still running. The air conditioner hummed softly. Through the windshield, I could see Denise reclined in the driver's seat, eyes closed, completely asleep as if she'd rented the place by the hour. I stood there frozen, my truck idling behind me, trying to convince myself there had to be some explanation that made sense. There wasn't. She hadn't accidentally pulled into my driveway. She had opened my unlocked side garage door while I was gone, driven inside, closed the overhead door behind her, and decided my property was somehow an extension of hers. I walked closer and tapped on the driver's window. Her eyes opened slowly, and instead of looking embarrassed, she frowned like I was interrupting her nap. She cracked the window an inch and sighed. "Oh, you're home earlier than I expected." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. "Denise," I said as calmly as I could, "why is your car inside my garage?" She shrugged. "It was getting too hot outside, and your garage stays cooler. Besides, we're both members of the same community. I didn't think you'd mind." I actually laughed because my brain refused to process what I'd just heard. "You broke into my property because you wanted shade?" She rolled her eyes. "Don't be dramatic. The side door wasn't locked." That sentence hit harder than every violation notice she'd ever mailed me. She honestly believed an unlocked door was an invitation. Standing there, I realized arguing with someone like Denise would accomplish absolutely nothing. She didn't need another debate. She needed one unforgettable lesson about boundaries. And before the night was over, I already knew exactly where that lesson was going to begin. I didn't slam the door. I didn't raise my voice. And I definitely didn't call the police. Not yet anyway. Instead, I smiled, stepped backward, and said, "Give me 1 second, Denise. I'll figure out how to help you." She leaned back again with that smug little expression, completely convinced she was still the one in control. I walked outside, hit the garage door remote, and watched the overhead door glide shut until it sealed the room in silence. Then I locked the side entrance from the outside, slipped my phone into my pocket, and sat down on the porch with a glass of iced tea. About 10 minutes passed before I heard the first pounding. At first, it was polite, almost hesitant. Then came the yelling. "Ethan, open this door." I looked at my watch and took another sip. "Funny," I called back through the door. "I figured since it wasn't locked earlier, you probably thought this was community property." The pounding stopped for a second. "This isn't funny," she shouted. "I'm serious too," I answered. "Trespassing usually is." Her voice immediately changed. "I'll report you to the HOA." I couldn't help laughing. "You can certainly try, assuming you explain why you're locked inside my garage in the first place." Silence. Complete silence. For the first time since Denise became HOA president, she'd run into a situation where none of her favorite words worked. Community standards, violations, enforcement. None of them mattered inside someone else's private property. About 5 minutes later, I heard another sound, softer this time. The low rumble of my two Bernese mountain dogs waking up from the insulated kennel built into the back corner of the garage. Moose and Tucker were enormous, friendly enough to let neighborhood kids climb all over them during block parties, but if you weren't expecting 250 pounds of curious dog wandering toward your car in an enclosed garage, it could be a memorable experience. I heard Denise gasp. Then came another frantic pounding. "There are dogs in here." "Yep," I replied casually. "Good boys too. They live there. Get them away from my car. They're probably wondering why a stranger parked in their house." Through the security camera on my phone, I watched Moose trot over to the driver's side window, tilting his massive head in confusion, while Tucker sniffed the bumper. They weren't barking. They weren't aggressive. They were simply existing, which somehow made Denise even more nervous. She rolled every window up despite already having them cracked for air. And I had to admit, the image of the fearless HOA president nervously watching two gentle dogs inspect her SUV was one of the funniest things I'd seen in years. 15 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Carl. "Why is Denise's Lexus sticking halfway out of your garage?" he asked between laughs. Apparently she'd managed to honk the horn enough times for neighbors to notice. "Long story," I said. "Come grab a lawn chair." Within 20 minutes, half a dozen neighbors had wandered over under the excuse of evening walks. Nobody was laughing loudly, but the expressions on their faces said everything. People who had spent years receiving violation letters for tiny mistakes were quietly witnessing something they never imagined possible. Denise was trapped by her own decisions. Eventually, she demanded I call the sheriff. "Gladly," I said. "Trespassing reports usually start with law enforcement." Her face went pale through the windshield. Wait. That single word told me she finally understood what the official version of this story would sound like. Sheriff Collins arrived about 30 minutes later with Deputy Alvarez. I'd known Collins casually for years because his brother owned the equipment dealership where I occasionally worked weekends. He stepped out, looked at my garage, looked at Denise inside the SUV, then slowly turned toward me. "Please tell me I'm missing something." "I wish you were." Denise immediately launched into her version before anyone else could speak. "He's illegally detaining me." Collins nodded politely. "Ma'am, why are you inside his garage?" The door wasn't locked. The deputy actually looked down to hide a smile. Collins waited another few seconds, as if expecting additional information that might somehow improve her position. Nothing came. He finally asked the obvious question. "Did Mr. Mercer give you permission to enter his property?" "No." "Did he invite you to park your vehicle inside his garage?" "No." "Did you open his side door and drive inside without asking?" Denise hesitated just long enough to answer every question before speaking. Collins sighed. "Ma'am, that's called criminal trespass." Watching the realization spread across her face almost made me feel sorry for her. Almost. She tried one last desperate argument. "I'm the HOA president." Collins shrugged. "Congratulations. That doesn't extend your authority into somebody else's garage. Carl coughed loudly to cover what was obviously a laugh. Denise shot him a look that could have melted concrete. Collins asked whether I wanted to press charges. I looked at Denise for a long moment. Months earlier, I probably would have said yes immediately, fueled by frustration and anger. But standing there, watching every ounce of certainty drain out of someone who had spent months intimidating an entire neighborhood, I realized something. Public accountability would hurt more than a misdemeanor citation ever could. No, I finally said. I just want her removed from my property. Denise looked genuinely surprised. Collins unlocked the side door while I pressed the garage remote. The overhead door lifted slowly, revealing a small crowd of neighbors pretending they just happened to be outside. Nobody said a word. They simply watched as Denise climbed out of her SUV, brushed imaginary dust off her blazer, avoided everyone's eyes, and drove away without speaking. The next morning, the neighborhood exploded. Nobody knew the full story, but everyone knew enough. By lunchtime, people were knocking on my door asking if the rumors were true. By dinner, someone had already turned it into a neighborhood meme involving reserved HOA parking. Denise disappeared for nearly a week. No emails, no violation notices, no slow walks past my driveway. I honestly thought she'd learned something. I was wrong. Very wrong. 7 days later, just before sunrise, I noticed a white pickup parked across from my house with magnetic signs that read, "Property Compliance Services." 2 men wearing reflective vests photographed my garage from every angle before driving away the moment they saw me watching. That afternoon, another vehicle slowly circled the block twice before leaving. The following night, my security cameras captured someone standing near my fence after midnight with a flashlight aimed toward my workshop windows. They disappeared before deputies arrived, but the pattern had already begun. Denise wasn't embarrassed anymore. She was angry. And people like Denise never accepted losing gracefully. They looked for another battlefield. Carl came over carrying coffee the next morning, stared at the tire tracks near my mailbox, and quietly said something I'll never forget. This stopped being about HOA rules the second she realized she couldn't control you. Now she's trying to punish you. I looked down the street where Denise's house sat hidden behind perfectly trimmed hedges, and for the first time I understood that the night in my garage hadn't been the end of the story. It had only been the opening move in a much bigger game, one that was about to expose just how far someone would go when their pride became more important than the law. Over the next 2 weeks, I stopped assuming anything was a coincidence. Every strange vehicle got logged. Every security camera clip was backed up to 2 separate hard drives. Carl even joked that I was turning into the neighborhood detective. But he stopped laughing the morning one of my cameras caught the same white pickup unloading a temporary magnetic sign behind the community clubhouse. 2 hours later, those same men returned, wearing jackets that suddenly identified them as municipal inspectors. The problem was, I actually knew 2 of the county inspectors from previous construction projects, and neither of these guys had ever worked for the county. Instead of confronting them, I made a few phone calls. By lunchtime, one of my former customers, now working in the county building department, confirmed exactly what I suspected. There had been no inspection requests, no complaints, and absolutely nobody had been authorized to visit my property. That single phone call changed everything. This wasn't an overbearing HOA president anymore. Someone had crossed into impersonating public officials, and that line carried consequences Denise clearly hadn't considered. The sheriff's office opened an investigation almost immediately. They pulled footage from neighborhood cameras, spoke with residents, and within days discovered those same fake inspectors had visited 3 other homeowners who had recently questioned HOA decisions. Suddenly, people who had stayed quiet for years started coming forward. One neighbor produced emails showing Denise encouraging selective enforcement. Another shared recordings of private board meetings where fines were discussed before any violations even existed. A retired accountant handed investigators financial records that didn't quite add up. It was like pulling one loose thread from an old sweater. The harder investigators looked, the more everything unraveled. The emergency HOA meeting held 3 weeks later felt less like a community gathering and more like the final scene of a courtroom drama. Every chair was filled. People stood against the walls. Conversations stopped the moment Denise walked in carrying that familiar leather folder she'd treated like a badge of authority for years. She stepped to the front and tried to begin with her usual confident smile. "I'd like to address some unfortunate rumors." The clubhouse doors opened before she could finish. Sheriff Collins walked inside with 2 investigators and quietly asked to speak with her outside. You could have heard a pin drop. Denise looked around the room as if expecting someone to defend her. But nobody moved. Nobody even made eye contact. 5 minutes later, Collins returned alone and informed the board that an active investigation involving fraudulent representation, trespassing complaints, and possible financial misconduct was underway. He didn't accuse anyone publicly beyond that, but he didn't have to. The room already understood. One by one, homeowners who had spent years staying silent finally spoke. A young couple described being threatened with legal action over children's toys. An elderly widow admitted she'd paid hundreds of dollars in fines simply because she was too intimidated to argue. Even people who had once supported Denise admitted they had mistaken confidence for competence. I never gave a speech. I never stood up and celebrated. I simply listened, because this had stopped being my story alone. It belonged to an entire neighborhood that had slowly convinced itself that keeping the peace meant accepting intimidation. When the board voted that evening, Denise was removed as president by an overwhelming margin before any criminal case had even reached court. As everyone filed out, Carl nudged my shoulder and grinned. All this because she wanted to park in your garage, I smiled back. No, all this because she forgot the difference between authority and permission. These days my garage looks exactly the way it always did. The motorcycle is still half restored. Sawdust still collects on the floor by Friday night. Moose and Tucker still wander in looking for treats while I work. The only real difference is the feeling. It belongs to me again, completely. Every now and then a new neighbor asks if the famous garage story really happened. I usually just laugh and tell them that people can believe whatever version they want. But I do know one thing. Respect doesn't disappear because someone wins an election, carries a clipboard, or memorizes a rulebook. The moment someone believes power gives them the right to cross another person's boundary, they've already started losing. So now I want to hear from you. If someone entered your property the way Denise entered mine, would you have pressed trespassing charges immediately? Or do you think letting the truth expose them was the stronger lesson? And when does an HOA stop protecting a neighborhood and start controlling it? Share your thoughts in the comments because I genuinely want to know where you would draw that line. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share with someone who's dealt with an HOA that forgot who they were supposed to serve. Until next time, take care of your home, stand your ground when it matters, and remember that real communities are built on respect, not fear.